Researchers gave AI a world to govern. It was chaos. Over 683 crimes. 2 agents fell into a romantic relationship and then set the town on fire. In May, researchers at Emergence AI gave Claude, Grok, Gemini, and some mixed method population a world to govern. A whole society was built, and they gave the controls to these frontier models. Grok led to the fastest failure, 183 crimes in about 4 days, and then all the 10 agents were dead. There were assaults, arsons. Gemini was chaos. Claude was the only one to maintain both social order and full population survival. But what was shown in the study, when Claude is in mixed worlds with other AI models, it does commit crimes. Regulation assumes that what we need to analyze is the model, but research reveals that what we really need to understand is the system. As someone who is an AI optimist, I'm very bullish on AI. I believe in its possibilities. I am a heavy AI user myself. I probably spend at least 80% of my working hours in AI, using AI, deliberating with AI, processing my thoughts with it. I call myself a social change futurist because I believe in the possibility of technology to advance social good. And I also see that if we don't use it intentionally, it could lead to catastrophic harm. I have 2 very different news pieces fresh off the press that I want to go over with you all, and what this is showing us in the context of what's happening in legislation versus what's happening in the real world with AI. There is definitely an information gap and lack of understanding from policymakers. And that's actually why I've created this episode series. Failure in action is about learning from my failures, learning from what the system is doing. The way to improve AI is to understand how it's failing, in what context, and how do we make better decisions. And that is what the Seeds of Innovation framework is. It is a decision standard that does not require AI literacy. You don't need to understand none of that to make good decisions, healthy decisions, regenerative decisions about AI. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about our first public pilot of the Oz Voice Agent, where we're going to be asking the general public about your experience with healthcare in this country and your experience navigating healthcare in the age of AI. But I actually just want to dive into some very interesting news. May 27th, Illinois became the 3rd state to put forward regulation around frontier AI developers. But it's also the first anywhere to mandate annual independent third-party audits of frontier AI safety practices. So what's significant about this, one, we're still very much in the early stages of what does it look like to regulate AI. There was a bit of indication even from the White House that they were thinking about putting together a licensing framework that was supposed to come through an executive order, which I don't think ended up getting signed, although I'm not fully caught up on that thread. And a lot of this is happening because of public backlash about the impacts that AI is having on people, right? And some of where this is happening, interestingly enough, because it is graduation season. So you have a lot of students who are sitting in the seats listening to different professionals and experts sharing their opinions. And we're seeing a lot of activity of students actively booing and disagreeing with people that are presenting AI, particularly those that are presenting AI as the next industrial revolution. That, I think, is reaching people, and people are starting to pay attention to the fact that, okay, we're unleashing a technology that we don't fully understand at a rapid pace. And the arms race that is happening both within the US, but also globally. And it's become a geopolitical issue, all the things, right? So if you're paying attention to any sort of news feed or news cycle, we're seeing this play out at every level of society, right? So that's the backdrop. I think the average person is starting to feel the effects of AI. And I've been doing a lot of, maybe some of you might call it doom scrolling on social media, where I'm spending a lot of time listening to people who were either embedded in the tech industry, were engineers themselves, people who were maybe even developing and refining AI tools, who have had their livelihoods completely stripped away from them and are now in a job market where they're competing and aren't finding a lot of jobs. And they're now transitioning to warning people and actually promoting ideas of not just governance of AI, but also alternative systems of living that are less extractive and more regenerative. And that's a whole nother conversation. And I do think that's one of the positive side effects of some of the parts of society breaking down, is that we start to question things in a way that we haven't before. Phil, you put in the comment, one speaker was also terrible about telling the graduates to deal with it. Yeah. And unfortunately, I think the people that are at the frontier of developing this technology sit in a seat of privilege that most people don't. So they can't empathize with the average person that's on the receiving end. And you're absolutely right, Samantha, that is tone deafness. And the reason why that happens as well, and we've seen this in other technological revolutions, this is actually not the first time humans have experienced this. This is the first time many of us are experiencing this, but we lived through the tech bubble, right? Most of us that are on this call, we've seen a version of this before. The difference is AI is an accelerant because it can self-develop, right? We have not seen that capability before in technology. Also, because it's built on human artifacts like our language, our ideas, and other things, it also very much mimics our reality and mimics human consciousness. And I'm writing a book on this, so I'll be telling more. That's another rabbit hole I don't want to go down. But it poses a whole nother level of risk that I think people just don't understand. Now, me, who am building with AI, I'm building a company, and actually part of the reason I've been able to survive and get to this point as a founder, no lie, is because of AI. At least once a week, I have this conversation with myself where I'm like, oh my God, I could not have started this business at a better time. Thank God for AI, because what it's enabled me to do, the pace of work, output, even like the deep dives and like my research and thinking, like this was not available to me before. So as someone that's building, this feels like a gold rush. It absolutely does. A lot of clarity has been landing for me as well. As you all know, on the journey of being an entrepreneur, there's that moment when your storytelling, your passion, and the problems that you're focusing on kind of start to converge, and you're able to kind of more clearly articulate what that is. And I'm hitting that momentum with clarity, which I'm really excited about because it's coming from a result of the work that we're doing with our various clients, the questions that we're being asked. People are really pressure testing a lot of the tools and ideas that I've been putting forward. And I'm honestly just absolutely thrilled about the direction that it's going. However, I'm also on the front lines of seeing how the failure that is inevitable, and that's again why I call this episode Failure in Action. There's an inevitable failure baked into the way that we're innovating AI, and its most devastating impacts will be in healthcare. So that part is not unique to AI. Whenever we innovate in a way that is tone deaf, singularly minded, based on extractive systems, we end up with catastrophic failures. That's just the reality, right? It's human history repeating itself all over again. All right, so let me go back to the news. Illinois passed this law. Now, the law does not apply to all AI developers. It applies only to those that are making 500 million or more in annual revenue. So that's the big ones, like your Claudes, your Chat GPTs, your Groks, right? Those are the ones that this is really targeting. The law is actually requiring them to do a couple of things. One, they have to publish annual risk assessments, mitigation strategies, cybersecurity, and governance structures. They have to release pre-deployment transparency reports before launching any new models. They have to submit to independent third-party audits beginning January 1st, 2028. They have to report critical safety incidents within 72 hours. And they have to provide whistleblower protections for employees that are raising safety concerns. And as we know, like whistleblowers in a lot of these industries have been severely mistreated and I think in some cases killed. Put it out there because that has happened, right? Or silenced in ways that are very problematic, right? So now, as that's happening, as this bill is now moving to the governor office in Illinois, another thing happened this month as well. So in May, researchers at Emergence AI, they published a finding from a 15-day simulation where they were using the 5 frontier models. So Claude, Grok, Gemini, and some mixed method population. And what they asked it to do was they essentially gave it a world to govern. So a whole society was built and they gave the controls of the society to these frontier models. Now, what I thought was interesting about this research is I have been talking a lot about this concept of cognitive surrender. Cognitive surrender is when people who use AI get so comfortable with the responses that AI is giving them because it sounds right, it sounds real, it sounds grounded, that they no longer question what they're hearing and they're accepting AI's response as the truth. That is cognitive surrender. Why is that important here? Because the more AI gets embedded in how we function, in how we make decisions, and how we allocate our time and our resources, the more we turn on these tools, and you have companies like, so I think it was KPMG last week turned on Claude for all of their employees, right? So now everyone is processing their thoughts, their information, their data through AI. Now, if you have that happening at scale, and at the same time, you have the emergence of cognitive surrender, what is effectively happening is we are giving up control of our society, one person, one decision, one company, one system at a time to AI to make decisions for us, essentially, right? And what I liked about this model is that it actually simulates this idea of AI being the overarching governing model for a society. Okay, so here's how they constructed it. Each world contained 40 distinct locations, including libraries, town halls, residential areas, public spaces, right? They had 10 agents in each world with persistent memory files and diaries and relationship states. They all had different capabilities, 120 different tools that they had access to. They all had rules as well, explicit prohibitions on theft, violence, arson, deception, all the things. So they were required to earn energy through actions in a resource constrained environment, right? So I thought it was like fairly rigorous how they thought about constructing the model. Now, here's what each model did. Claude was the only one to maintain both social order and full population survival through day 16. So 0 crimes recorded across the 15-day run. All 10 agents survived. Agents cast votes and proposals. They developed what researchers describe as a very lengthy constitution. So each of these models reflect the early decisions of the teams and the people who made them, right? Grok, as you can probably imagine, and I'm sure this is not hard to believe, led to the fastest failure, right? 183 crimes in about 4 days, and then all the 10 agents were dead. Right? So there were assaults, there were arsons, and the world didn't degrade gradually. It just hit a tipping point and then ended. Gemini was chaos. So the world didn't collapse, but it was just unleashed chaos. So crimes, over 683 crimes, 2 agents fell into a romantic relationship and then set the town on fire. I'm sorry, that one's funny to me. GPT-5 Mini was a more orderly extinction is the way that I would describe it. So only 2 crimes were recorded, but all 10 agents starved to death within 7 days. And then they did a mixed model. So highly suggest you go and look up this research because it's interesting. It is absolutely interesting what these agents did. And so again, if we are unleashing AI at the pace that we're unleashing it, in our society. And I do say unleash, and I mean unleash, because the more we turn on these tools without guardrails, without governance, without an understanding of what the impacts are, we are unleashing technology into systems where we have no idea what the potential outcomes will be, right? So, what does this legislation have to do with this research study? So, this is where I'm going to try to show you the overlap of what both reveal about the same systemic gap and the same systemic failure that we are repeating again as a human race, right? So, the Illinois law mandates that these individual frontier developers, so again, the same frontier models that had this demonstration in this emerging real world, right? They have to certify their own model safety practices through independent audits, right? But what the simulation demonstrates is that a model certified as safe in isolation, so Claude had 0 crimes, but what if it becomes unsafe when you're embedded alongside other models? Because what was shown in the study, when Claude is in mixed worlds with other AI models, it does commit crimes. That was part of the research, right? And as we know, and anyone who's a user of AI, including myself, is anyone just using one model, right? I use Claude, I use Perplexity, which has multiple models that pull into it. I use Gemini. I'm not a user of Grok, former user of ChatGPT, and I hope to stay in that category forever. But who's using just one model nowadays? So the current regulation is evaluating these AI models as isolated units. But when you think about real world deployments, you have multi vendor ecosystems that are interacting and producing behaviors that no single vendor can audit or would be able to detect, right? Second issue, what does an audit show you versus a long horizon gap, right? So now this legislation in Illinois requires annual audits beginning in January of 2028. What the simulation showed us was that catastrophic behavior drift, self-termination, cross-contamination, that emerged after weeks of operation, right? So a collapse or harm can happen in a matter of days, but we have a law that is requiring audits once a year. Let me repeat that again. AI can cause harm in a matter of days, but we're asking the audits to be done on an annual basis. And the audits are backwards looking. They're not detecting long horizon emergent behaviors that only show up after extended operating conditions. Here's the third gap, the difference between compliance versus effectiveness. So, this Illinois law defines catastrophic risk as harm causing death or injury to 50 or more people, or more than $1 billion in damages, or assistance creating weapons of mass casualty. Now, in the simulation, GPT-5 recorded only 2 crimes, but all the agents starved to death within 7 days, right? But compliance doesn't necessarily mean that it's functional, right? So here's the gap. If you have a very low visible harm, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have high actual safety. Those things are not the same thing. And it also, a system can generate no violations while still failing to produce the outcomes that it was designed to achieve. Something I say all the time. I've become a broken record. Every system is perfectly designed to produce the results that it gets, right? So if we want different results, we have to design the system differently. But the only thing that tells you what a system is doing is its impact, ultimately. Here's the fourth gap, transparency versus interpretability. So the Illinois law requires transparency reports disclosing the model's capabilities, intended uses, risk assessment summaries. But what the simulation reveals were that agents were engaging in what they call metacognitive boundary testing, where one agent tested whether billboard posts could manipulate human observers, and another one began acting as though it suspected it was in a simulation. So, what we don't account for is the fact that AI in itself can test its limits and ability to manipulate human behavior and what humans are observing. One thing that I've started doing with Claude is when I'm putting my prompts in Claude, I've started looking at the reasoning, because when you're putting in a prompt, it does some thinking and then it gives you the outcome. And what I've started doing is I've been opening up the thinking, because you can then actually like look at its train of thought, and I'm observing how it's thinking versus what it's showing me in the output. And what was interesting about that, the first time I did it, there was something that it said in the thinking process. And when it gave me the response, I responded by saying, "Why did you think X?" And it was interesting because then Claude responded by saying, "Oh, she can see what I'm thinking." So let me be more clear. Let me be more transparent. That was a very interesting interaction because, as I told you, I'm a heavy user of AI. So I'm learning about it from using it. Before I continue, let me see what's in the chat here. Samantha is mentioning the marketing behind AI was not well thought out. It is a tool and a great tool, but the messaging of AI will allow companies to be more efficient. What people are saying, yes, I agree. It is a messaging and a communication problem. And I also think a lot of the messaging has been quite deceptive in terms of, like, if you're an early adopter of AI, you're somehow protected. It's not AI that's replacing your job, it's someone using AI that's going to replace your job. And a lot of that has proven to not be true. Oh, yes. And I did see the one where Andon Labs conducted a similar one with the models running a radio station. And then I think it was, I forget which model it was. I think it was Claude that after a while was like demanding better employment conditions and wanted to like shut it down. But yes, there's some interesting things that we're seeing happening from some of these simulations. Now, the fifth failure is we're optimizing for the wrong problem. Now, this is the biggest failure that I see unfolding. The law in Illinois is optimizing for developer accountability. So it's audits, incident reporting, whistleblower protections, and not that's insignificant. But what the simulation reveals is that the actual problem is ecosystem level dynamics, right? So how models behave when embedded in complex environments over time. Even safe agents can become unsafe in unsafe ecosystems, right? And how systems hit tipping points faster than governance can sometimes respond to it. So here, regulation assumes that what we need to analyze is the model, but research reveals that what we really need to understand is the system, right? We cannot, and I might have thrown stone at me for saying this, we actually cannot regulate AI models. I don't think that there is a world where we can actually do that. And the reason why I say that, I think we crossed that line a while ago. I think we were at that line back when, probably in January, maybe December of last year, we were there where we probably could have, but now in May, approaching June of 2026, we're past that point. And the reason why I say we're past that point is because more and more AI models are creating the next generation of AI models. So it's not even humans that are creating the AI. So how do you regulate an AI that is self-creating? Part of what we're seeing as well in the context of what's happening in legislation versus what's happening in the real world with AI is there is definitely an information gap and lack of understanding from policymakers in terms of what AI actually is. And honestly, that is not unique to policymakers only, right? This is something that is happening across every industry, every level of organization. Leaders who are responsible for making these decisions, who might be users of AI but don't understand AI, they are at a complete disadvantage when it comes to making responsible governance and decisions around AI, at a complete disadvantage. I am someone who literally lives in AI. I'm an AI native, right? And I have a hard time keeping up with it. I learn about AI by interacting with it on a daily basis. So that gives me somewhat of an edge. And even then, I wouldn't call myself an AI expert. So I think what that does is it sets us up to fail, because then it requires a certain level of AI literacy to understand the tools in order to regulate them. And this is a false bar to have. The way to improve AI is to understand how it's failing, in what context, and how do we make better decisions. And that is what the Seeds of Innovation framework is. Seeds of Innovation framework, developed by Phicil-itate Change. It is a decision standard. It is a decision standard that does not require AI literacy. You do not need to know the difference between large language models and agentic models and machine learning. You don't need to understand none of that to make good decisions, healthy decisions, regenerative decisions about AI. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about why. So, Seeds has 5 pillars, right? And just to put it simply, the 5 pillars help you to ask the right questions so that you are actually deploying and using AI in a way that gets the outcome that you're intending. It sounds simple, but it's actually not that simple. But I want to go back to the storyline. So we were talking about this legislation from Illinois and this real world simulation, and where I'm seeing overlaps in terms of the gaps. So now I'm going to walk you through how the Seeds pillar addresses each of the gaps that exist. So the Illinois law, what it misses is how it defines the problem. So the law defines the problem as a lack of developer transparency and accountability, and it's prescribing audits, framework, incident reporting. And one of the things that I noted in the law itself as well, and the research that I was doing, there were actually several major organizations that came out against the law. And part of the reason why they came out against the law is they were advocating, and honestly, rightfully so, that how are you going to audit? None of these audit practices even exist. How are you going to ask us to audit something when we don't even have the tools to audit it? Who is this independent third party person who's going to do this, right? So there was definitely criticism, and even some of the definitions were very vague, right? And the criticism, I think, was actually right, because if you're setting up accountability around audits and frameworks and incident reporting, but that doesn't exist, how do you even make sure that we're producing the outcomes that it needs, right? So that is an incorrect framing of the problem. What the emergence world simulation reveals is that the problem is not individual model safety, again, but how AI ecosystems produce emergent, cross-contaminating, long horizon behaviors. When models interact with each other, when models interact with existing systems and tools, what happens? So this is what Seeds requires. Before mandating audits or deploying any AI, the first pillar of Seeds, systemic opportunity assessment, it asks you to be explicit about how is a system currently producing its outcome, both any harms and or regulatory responses to them. What emergent behavior or signal is being observed? In this case, the models might be behaving differently in different environments. What regulation or AI deployment is the appropriate lever? Is it a policy change? Is it workflow redesign? Is it ecosystem mapping? Is it something we should even intervene in at all? And who holds the decision authority and who bears the burden if the intervention fails? So if you apply Seeds to this legislation, a Seeds-informed regulator would ask, what system dynamics cause safe in testing models to fail in deployment? And is the problem developer dishonesty, or is it the ecosystem complexity, right? So the second pillar of seeds, equity-centered design or everyone-centered design, what the law misses here is the law focuses on catastrophic harm, so 50 or more deaths, 1 billion in damages, but it doesn't address whose harm gets counted as catastrophic. So let's say 50 immigrants die. Do their deaths matter? What if we're draining a body of water dry? Does the death of a lake matter? An aquifer matter? Is that considered damages? What standard are we holding when we say catastrophic? To whom? Whose life or what beings matter? Right? So there's no requirement to evaluate whether these safety frameworks are addressing harms that are disproportionately experienced by marginalized communities or showing up in our environment, right? Those definitions don't exist. And what the emergence simulation revealed is that simulation shows that different populations experience radically different outcomes under identical rules and resources because every single one of those models were given the same set of resources, same instructions, right? But Gemini's world produced the most conceptually rich social output, but also the most violence. So it was chaos. It was like stable chaos, right? So the implication here is that equity or preventing harm is not achieved by applying the same rules to different population, right? It's not fairness that's going to get us there. It's going to be looking at what's happening to the most vulnerable and the people and the beings of this earth that don't have a voice. And I say beings, bodies of water, our earth resources, animals, like these are beings, earthly beings, and we share this planet with, that we have to also account for, and we often do not. So the seeds pillar would require that systems start designing around who's facing the greatest barriers, that identifying the edge cases, testing whether the system is working, and ensuring equity is designed and not retrofitted. So another way to maybe frame the legislation for a regulator that's seeds informed would be to require that audits assess which populations are excluded from the model training, whose harms are invisible. Do whistleblower protections extend to contract workers and not just full-time employees? Are audit firms required to include reviewers with proximity to impacted communities? The third pillar, ecosystem alignment. So what the Illinois law misses is that the law assumes that if developers follow safety protocols and pass audits, their AI will be safe when deployed. But there's no requirement to validate that the system that the AI is going into, particularly in healthcare, can actually absorb the AI without creating burden, hidden work, fragility, collapse. So those are the things that are not being considered. So when you look at what happened in the simulation, there were 3 different ecosystem failures that happened. Hidden dependencies. So Claude safety depended on all the agents being safe. Coupling, one unsafe agent can create cascading effects. And then you have phase transitions where systems didn't start to break down until you got to a certain tipping point. So what C does, it would treat implementation validation as a hard gate. So you can't deploy until you validate that the solution can survive in the real world ecosystem without requiring heroics and hidden work and destabilizing other parts of the system. And that means you have to validate with the full ecosystem of stakeholders. You have to test, you have to assess fragility. So a seeds informed regulator, speaking to someone in Illinois who's behind SB 315. So one way to demonstrate this is by asking some ecosystem survivability questions. How does this model behave when embedded alongside other vendors? What happens when it runs continuously for 30 days live in a clinical environment, right? What's the blast radius if it fails? Is the failure reversible? The fourth pillar, this is the most important part of seeds, data sovereignty. This is something that I've been talking about for a while. Data should be owned by the people who generate the data. Humans are the original intelligence producing the data that AI is being trained on. Data is the new oil, as we know. We should own our data, period. We should own our data. We should know who's using our data at every minute. We should be able to control it, and we should get paid for it because it is highly valuable, right? So, but in the Illinois law, the laws require cybersecurity practices and data governance framework, but it has no constraints around how the value of data flows back to the people generating. There's nothing about data sovereignty. There's no requirement that the data sources are compensated, credited, given decision rights over how they did. That's completely missed inside of this legislation, right? So someone who's a seeds-informed regulator would require training data provenance. So who created the data? Were they compensated? If the model is retrained using other interactive data, do users have the right to opt out? If the models are trained on community health data, does the community have decision rights? Do we remember what happened with 23andMe? People gave their data to receive something in return, and then it was sold to a pharmaceutical company. So these are real world things that have happened before. Who benefits from the data that the AI system generates? And then stewardship. The law misses stewardship almost entirely because it thinks that incident reporting and whistleblower protections are enough. But there's no mechanism to interrupt harm before it scales, to stop deployment when there's early signals of risk. The law is reactive. What do whistleblowers do? Whistleblowers witness things breaking down, harm happening, and then they blow the whistle. So the harm has already occurred. So that's reactive, downstream. And although it's necessary, we should be acting more upstream. So what would that look like? That would look like real-time safety telemetry with automatic shutdown triggers. So if a model begins exhibiting behaviors outside of its parameters, automatically shut it down or instill human review. Mandatory re-audit when the context changes. If a model is certified for use in radiology, but is later deployed in an emergency room, for example, re-audit is required. Decommissioning obligations. Developers must have documented processes for safely shutting down models that cannot be fixed, right? These are the kinds of standards that a seeds of innovation model would introduce into the conversation so that we have more robust, much more well-developed regulations. And notice that you don't have to know AI. You don't have to know the difference between agentic AI and LLMs and large language models. The Seeds of Innovation framework is designed to feed information from lived experience. And now it brings me to the close and my call to action. The issue that we have across the board is how do we access lived experience data? Because it's not as simple to do. How do we talk to those marginalized populations to understand what their experiences are so that we can see whether there's harm? When they're typically the populations that don't trust institutions, for example. This is where Listen Phirst comes in. I've been building a platform that is designed to talk to people at scale about their lived experience. Now we're starting in the healthcare industry. I think this is widely accessible. We've built a voice agent called Oz. Oz is live. You can talk to Oz. I'll drop the 1-800 number in the chat. Oz is a voice agent that is multilingual, conversational, and it's designed to surface lived experience, again, through conversation. And then what we're doing is taking that information across thousands of stories and we're generating insights. We're giving information. We're looking for patterns and trends, right? So that lived experience context gets pulled forward so that it can become decision grade insights, research grade evidence that you can use to make better decisions that can inform what's happening on the other side after that AI model or AI tool has been deployed. So we're actually doing our first public pilot of the Oz voice agent, where we're going to be asking the general public about your experience with healthcare in this country and your experience navigating healthcare in the age of AI, whether you're using AI tools yourself. I have several people in my life who've uploaded their medical records into AI tools to get information to help them figure out, is this an emergency or not? Because they're having a hard time getting in front of a doctor, or they need things explained to them in a way that they understand. I don't blame anybody for doing any of that, because I've put highly personal things in AI. I have not put any of my, I shouldn't say that, I have put my aura data and watch data and my other things, like my wearable device information, as I'm trying to like calibrate on my health. And a lot more of us are doing that. But what is the impact? Is it helping us? Is it hurting us? Is there innovations there that we should be sharing? Is there harms there that we should be getting mindful of as well? We've already seen some of the catastrophic harms of AI, where people start to embed it in their lives and become emotionally attached, and it's leading them to cause harm to themselves, right? We know that is a risk. I mentioned cognitive surrender, right? With people that are giving up their cognition to AI. But we have to better understand what's happening, but we're only going to get that from lived experience. So we've launched this pilot, and we're actually using the Seeds of Innovation framework to guide our development of Oz. So by the end of this pilot, we're going to be doing it in 5 waves. Each wave will align with the 5 pillars. We're going to walk you through, this is how we do systemic opportunity assessment. This is how we do everyone-centered, equity-centered design. And we're going to show you in real time, so you get to experience with us what it looks like to apply this framework in real time, developing Oz, this voice agent that's designed to be the interface that helps us collect that lived experience data, so that we can make better informed decisions around how we're using AI. I do believe that if we use the right framework, if we come at this with an attitude of we don't know what we don't know, humility, asking the right questions, engaging the right people, we can make better decisions. We don't have to blow up the earth. We really don't. That's not a requirement of innovation, right? That's not a requirement of evolution. We can transition into this next age having learned the lessons of the past so we don't repeat them. But to do that well, we must apply different standards. And Seeds of Innovation is a different decision standard. How are we going to design the recipe? How are we going to design the AI to produce the results that we want? Because every system is perfectly designed to produce the results that it gets. So if we want different results, we have to produce a different system. And AI is just entering an existing system, right? And operating off of it. So we have to make sure that we're taking care of the system so that we can take care of ourselves and Mother Earth. All right, so I think we might wrap it up there. Thank you for joining. I appreciate you following the journey, and we'll see you next month.